Okay, here's a question for you. What if almost everything you thought you knew about Neanderthal diets was just wrong? I mean, for decades, right, we've had this picture of Neanderthals as these really rugged, uh, hyper carnivores, top of the food chain, feasting mostly on mammoths, that kind of thing. It's a pretty strong image. But today, we're going to do a deep dive that might just flip that image on its head. We'll be looking at some pretty recent science and even some surprising historical accounts. Our mission really is to unpack this long-held belief and show you a much more complex, maybe even startling picture of what Neanderthals were actually eating. Get ready for some moments that might challenge your assumptions.
Yeah, it's a fascinating shift. For the longest time, the scientific thinking was really anchored in one particular method. It involves looking at something called stable nitrogen isotope ratios. Specifically, they measure a heavier form of nitrogen, nitrogen-15, that builds up in bones. The basic idea is that this nitrogen-15 accumulates more the higher up the food chain you go.
Right, so more meat means higher levels.
Essentially, yes. And the traditional interpretation of Neanderthal bones, which showed really high levels of this heavy nitrogen, was pretty straightforward. They were seen as top trophic level consumers, right up there with the big predators at the time, like cave lions, wolves.
Okay, so apex predators.
Exactly. That put them at the very peak of the food web. And the conclusion was, well, they must have been eating almost entirely animal protein, huge amounts of it.
So that interpretation that they were basically living off endless mammoth steaks, that was kind of the standard view for decades, locked in science.
Pretty much. Those high nitrogen levels were seen as definitive proof of this hypercarnivore diet. Lots and lots of lean meat.
But you mentioned earlier there's a pretty major physiological problem with that neat picture.
Yes, there is. And this is where the whole hypercarnivore idea really starts to run into trouble. It comes down to basic human physiology. See, humans, unlike true hypercarnivores, have a pretty strict limit on how much protein we can actually process safely. It's about maybe 4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day.
Okay, and how does that compare to, say, a lion?
Well, a lion or other dedicated carnivores, they can handle maybe 2 to 4 times that amount, no problem. But if humans go over that limit, even for just a week or two, it can cause a really nasty, even potentially lethal condition. Early explorers actually call it rabbit starvation because if you try to live only on lean meat, like rabbit, your liver just gets overwhelmed.
Rabbit starvation, huh?
Yeah. It can't process all that protein effectively. You get a dangerous buildup of ammonia and excess amino acids in your blood. Really bad news.
Right. So, okay, what does this all mean then? If Neanderthals were hominins, like us,
Yeah, exactly.
and they couldn't physically handle the huge amounts of lean meat that those nitrogen levels seem to suggest, well, where did those super high isotope readings actually come from? That's the puzzle, isn't it?
That is absolutely the puzzle. And it's led researchers down a, well, pretty unexpected path. There's new groundbreaking research suggesting a really surprising solution. Neanderthals might have gotten those high, heavy nitrogen levels from eating maggots.
Wait, maggots.
Seriously. It sounds maybe a bit gross to us now, but there's actual experimental evidence backing this up. There's fascinating work by Dr. Melanie Beasley and her team. They work at the Forensic Anthropology Center at the University of Tennessee. You might know it as the body farm.
Oh, right, the body farm, okay.
So they study decomposition, and in this case, they looked at donated human bodies left to decompose naturally. They collected maggots, fly larvae from the putrefying muscle tissue, and then, crucially, they measured the heavy nitrogen levels, the A15N values in those maggots.
And what did they find?
This is the really key part. The muscle tissue itself, as it putrefied, it only showed modest increases in heavy nitrogen, but the maggots feeding on that tissue, their heavy nitrogen levels were significantly higher. We're talking values ranging from 5.4 all the way up to 43.2 parts per thousand.
Wow, that's a huge range and much higher.
Much, much higher than the meat they were eating. And often, get this, often higher than even the highest recorded values for Ice Age herbivores, the things Neanderthals were supposedly eating huge amounts of. Over 75% of the maggots they studied were higher.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting then. So if the maggots have these super high nitrogen levels, far higher than the meat, what does that do to the original interpretation of the Neanderthal bones?
It potentially flips it completely. It strongly suggests that the isotope signal we've been reading in Neanderthal bones for decades might be, as the researchers put it, more strongly a reflection of the maggots they consumed along with the meat, rather than just the meat itself.
Huh. So the signal isn't pure meat, it's meat plus maggots.
Or maybe even significantly influenced by the maggots ingested from putrefying stored meat.
Yes, that's wild.
Hmm.
Okay, so is there any other evidence for, well, people eating maggots? It sounds pretty out there from a modern perspective.
It does to us, maybe. But here's another fascinating layer. If you look at ethnohistoric records, accounts of traditional cultures eating maggots found in putrefied meat is actually, well, it's surprisingly common, especially among many indigenous groups, particularly northern foragers. And it's important to note, this wasn't usually seen as, like, starvation food.
Not desperation.
No, often quite the opposite. It was frequently considered highly desirable fare, sometimes even a delicacy.
A delicacy, wow. Are there specific accounts of this?
Oh, yeah. Some of the accounts from explorers are incredibly vivid. You read about companions scooping up handfuls of the crawling things with evident relish.
Yeah, and descriptions saying they tasted just like live caribou meat and were even refreshing to the mouth.
Refreshing. That's something. There's another great quote you mentioned about the smell.
Ah, yes. Someone apparently asked how they could stand the stench of the putrefying meat, and the answer was simply, we don't eat the smell.
We don't eat the smell. I love that. It really forces you to check your own cultural biases about what's food and what isn't, doesn't it? Absolutely. And this wasn't just accidental. These groups often intentionally harvested the maggots. They'd collect them from under meat drying racks or purpose-built storage platforms. There are even accounts of collecting specific types, like warble fly larvae, from under the hides of freshly killed caribou and reindeer in the spring.
So it was a known resource.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What was the nutritional value?
Fat and calories. That seems to be the key. Maggots are nutrient-dense, particularly rich in fat. And that was incredibly important, especially in environments where lean meat might be plentiful, but fat was the limiting nutrient. We'll come back to that fat focus.
And you mentioned it's not just an ancient or remote thing either. There's a modern example.
Right, just to show how subjective food preferences are. Think about casu marzu. It's a traditional cheese from Sardinia.
Oh, I think I've heard of that one. The maggot cheese.
That's the one. It's intentionally infested with cheese fly larvae. People eat it, larvae and all. So this idea isn't entirely alien even in modern Europe.
Okay, so how does all this, the maggots, the ethnohistoric accounts, tie back to Neanderthals and their lifestyle? How did they end up eating this stuff?
It connects directly to their likely hunting and, crucially, storage practices. Like many hunter-gatherers, especially in colder climates, Neanderthals would have faced unpredictable hunting success. You might get a mammoth one week, then nothing for a while.
So they had to store food.
Exactly. Storing surplus meat and fat in caches would have been vital. And the ethnohistoric records give us ideas about how they might have done it. People stored meat in above-ground piles of rocks called cairns, or hung it from trees, sometimes submerged it in ponds or bogs, or buried it in pits.
Okay.
Now, the crucial thing is, if you're storing meat like this, especially for weeks, months, maybe even longer, it almost inevitably began to putrefy and become infested with maggots. It's just a natural process.
Even in the cold, you'd think the Ice Age would slow that down.
You would, but there's a counterintuitive twist. Accounts mention that even winter-killed caribou in temperatures way below freezing, like minus 45 Fahrenheit, could still putrefy quite quickly inside. Their thick fur, their pelage, acts as amazing insulation, trapping the body heat and allowing decomposition to start from the inside out.
Never thought of that. Okay, so stored meat often putrefied and got maggots. But why eat that specific meat? Weren't they hunting all the time?
They were hunting, yes. But remember the protein limit we talked about?
Right, rabbit starvation.
Exactly. Because of that physiological limit, ancient hunters, and likely Neanderthals too, couldn't just live on lean muscle meat. They had to prioritize fat. So they deliberately targeted the fattest animals they could find. And when they butchered a carcass, they focused on the choice parts, the ones richest in fat.
Like what?
Things like the brain, the tongue, fatty ribs, bone marrow, certain organs. They often actually discarded large quantities of the lean muscle meat.
Really? They'd leave meat behind?
Absolutely. This practice, sometimes called surplus killing, where lean meat was left, is documented hundreds of times in ethnohistoric accounts. Maybe they fed it to any companion animals like proto-dogs, or just left it. Fat was the prize.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. How does this maggot theory, combined with the focus on fat and storage, solve that original isotope puzzle?
It provides a really elegant explanation, actually. The high, heavy nitrogen levels in Neanderthal bones don't necessarily mean they were eating vast quantities of lean meat like a lion or wolf. Instead, those high equiphytian values likely indicate a diet that included significant amounts of fat-rich tissues,
Okay.
often consumed after a period of storage, during which they naturally putrefied and became infested with those highly nitrogen-15 enriched maggots. They ate the fat, and the maggots came along for the ride, boosting the nitrogen signal.
So the signal isn't hypercarnivore, it's more like stored fatty foods with bonus maggots.
That's a crude way to put it, but yeah, directionally correct. It means Neanderthals weren't necessarily dietarily special just because they ate meat. Instead, maybe they were dietarily special as an omnivore who processes, stores, putrefies food. The high nitrogen signal might reflect these complex cultural practices of food handling and storage rather than just simple hypercarnivory.
This really does shift the perspective, doesn't it? It paints Neanderthals not as simple brutes focused only on the kill, but as, well, intelligent and adaptable, having complex strategies for getting food, storing it, processing it, dealing with environmental challenges, much like other successful hominins. It suggests real resourcefulness, especially in getting that crucial fat.
Exactly. It shows a sophisticated understanding of their environment and nutritional needs. Of course, this is still ongoing research. The study is a fantastic start, but the authors themselves point out we need more work. We need to look at isotopes in maggots from different types of animals, not just human tissue analogs,
Right.
and explore how different traditional preservation methods like smoking or drying might affect these nitrogen signals. What about microbes in the soil affecting buried caches? There's a lot more detail to figure out.
And the maggots themselves.
Yeah, we need better analysis of the macronutrients, the fat, protein, etc., in maggots at different life stages. It's all about building a much more complex, realistic model of their food system. And a big question still remains, quantitatively, how much maggot biomass would someone actually need to eat to significantly bump up their bone nitrogen values to the levels we see in Neanderthals? That needs more modeling.
Fascinating. So this whole deep dive, it really underscores how our own modern ideas, maybe even our yuck factor about certain foods, can really cloud our view of the past. Neanderthals seem far more sophisticated, more flexible in their food strategies than we often give them credit for. True ingenuity born from necessity.
It definitely challenges our biases, and it leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? What other foods, things we might find unappetizing or simply overlooked today, might have been absolutely critical for survival in different times and places? And what does exploring that tell us about human adaptability and resourcefulness both back then and maybe even now?